You've heard that Magna Carta created liberty. But before charters were signed and principles proclaimed, the crisis began as a struggle over money, authority, and restraint. In early 13th century England, power was enforced not only by force of arms, but by fees, fines, and relentless financial pressure. That balance collapsed under John, who transformed royal finance into a tool of coercion. Scutage was levied to extract cash instead of service, tallage was imposed to drain towns, and fines were set not to resolve disputes, but to keep them open indefinitely. This wasn't legend or later invention. It was recorded, audited, and remembered. And its message to the barons was clear: pay, comply, or bend. In this documentary, we'll follow the paper trail that led from England before liberty to the road to Runnymede. We'll see how years of financial pressure hardened opposition, how grievances accumulated rather than disappeared, and why rebellion became a calculated response rather than a reckless gamble. Understanding this story is essential to understanding Magna Carta itself. The Charter was not born from idealism, but from arithmetic. From limits tested, trust exhausted, and authority pushed too far. By tracing how money reshaped power, we can see how England moved from submission to confrontation, and why liberty emerged not as a gift, but as a demand. The world we're entering is England before 1066, where liberty didn't sit on parchment or in a courtroom. Status defined what you could do and what others could do to you. A free man's privileges came from birth or a lord's goodwill. A serf's duties came from custom that stretched back before anyone could remember. The king existed, but he was not a daily presence. Power lay closer to home, in the hall of a local lord, the precinct of a monastery, or the boundary of a village where everyone knew who owed what and to whom. Law had more than one voice, and none of them were final. Shire courts and hundred courts met under local officials, but the men who mattered, landholders, reeves, abbots, shaped outcomes by influence and reputation. Two neighboring valleys could decide the same dispute in different ways and call both custom. A thief might pay compensation in one place and lose a hand in another. Written rules were rare. Memory and precedent carried more weight than a seal. When conflicts escalated, oaths from kin and neighbors stood in for evidence, and the loudest backing often won. For most people, obligation made the calendar. Labor service on the demesne happened by season. Plowing, weeding, harvest, hauling wood, repairing fences and bridges. Rents in kind, barley, oats, eggs, a piglet at Martinmas, recurred with the saints' days. Many owed hospitality when the Lord's men passed through and tolls at markets that the Lord controlled. In return, they expected little more than permission to use strips in the open fields, common rights to graze a few animals, and occasional protection during raids. If wolves took sheep or a neighbor's boundary crept, the remedy came through the same lord who demanded the dues. Justice tracked the hierarchy. A noble accused of wrongdoing could settle matters with a payment, a formal oath backed by reputable men, or a negotiated fine. A poor tenant who angered a steward might face a beating, eviction, or a penalty far larger than his means. Church officers occupied their own lane. Clergy had access to ecclesiastical courts where penance and restitution were common, shielding them from harsher secular penalties. Bishops and abbots also acted as lords, holding courts over their tenants and collecting their own revenues from pleas and fines, so the line between sacred and secular blurred when money was at stake. No one spoke of individual rights as a shield against authority. Freedom meant you were not personally owned, not that you could demand fair treatment against your better. What restrained a lord was shame, custom, fear of feud, or the need to keep his workforce intact. What restrained a king was distance, logistics, and the necessity of cooperation from those same lords. People made bargains because they had to, and they kept them because losing protection could mean losing a harvest. And when guilt or innocence could not be settled by witnesses or oaths, the court called on God to decide. Trial by ordeal was not theater. It was procedure. A hand bound and plunged into boiling water, then sealed and inspected days later for clean healing. A man tied and thrown into a river to see whether he sank or floated. If the wound healed well, if the water accepted you, the verdict cleared your name. These were not superstitions shrugged off at the edges. They were tools of judgment used by the communities that relied on them, a final resort when human power ran out and divine power was asked to step in. Feudal England ran on a simple trade, land for service. A king granted a great lord an estate, and in return that lord owed mounted warriors weeks of castle guard and obedience when summoned. The lord then parceled portions to his own followers who owed smaller, specific duties to him. At every level, tenure described the bargain. How many nights, how many days' work, how many payments at set moments like inheritance or marriage. These were not favors. They were obligations that defined who showed up with horses, who kept roads open, and who held the gate when danger came. Everyone sat somewhere in the chain, giving service upward and receiving protection downward, at least in theory. The king stood at the top, but his reach depended on those below him. He could call a host, but he did not command an army that answered only to him. Powerful barons controlled whether orders turned into action. If they delayed, argued about terms, or stayed home, a royal plan stalled. Kings courted them with grants of land, rights to collect tolls, guardianship over heiresses, and shares of legal revenues. They also threatened them, seizing hostages, withholding confirmations of title, or moving crown officers into contested shires. Authority worked through relationships more than through permanent institutions, so victory in politics often meant balancing rivalries rather than issuing decrees. Across the realm, major nobles functioned like mini-kings. They held multiple manors scattered across counties with their own halls, chapels, and garrisons. Their stewards ran courts that handled disputes among tenants, assigned fines, and recorded customary dues. Their constables stocked granaries and armories and could raise a retinue at short notice. When neighbors quarreled over boundaries, mills, or hunting rights, a baron's court often served as the first and last stop. The noble's banner promised security to his people and leverage against his peers. In bad harvests, he decided whether to remit rents. In feuds, whether to press a claim. In a summons, whether to ride. Kings relied on presence and performance. Royal progress, moving from estate to estate, showed strength, rewarded loyalty with public notice, and reminded local officers who held patronage. Grants and pardons came sealed with authority, but their force rested on fear of losing the king's goodwill. Few written limits confined royal choice. If a sheriff served well, he kept office and its profits. If he failed, he could be replaced and prosecuted for arrears. The calculus was visible. Do the king's business and prosper, or hesitate and risk ruin. Disputes rarely met neutral arbitration. Force, mediation by higher lords, or calculated gifts settled matters. A claimant might gather kin and supporters to pressure a settlement, while the opponent courted a mightier patron. An oath with reputable witnesses mattered, but the weight behind an oath mattered more. Law existed, but muscle and access steered outcomes. In theory, all land in England belonged to the king. Every estate was a holding from the crown, held for service, rent, and good behavior. That meant a noble's wealth sat on royal permission. Confirmations of title, charters for markets, licenses to fortify, all depended on staying in favor. Loyalty was not sentimental. It was how fortunes avoided forfeiture and heirs received their due. The stakes turned political choices into questions of survival, and they kept attention fixed on the man who could validate every claim. When the Normans took the throne, they didn't inherit a loose confederation. They built a command center. William's administration counted, mapped, and ordered. Royal writs gained force across shires, and sheriffs answered to the king's household, not to local consensus. Revenue from royal lands flowed more predictably because the crown pushed its men into the counties and kept them on a short leash. The court at the center moved with purpose. Grants, forfeitures, and judgments reinforced the idea that decisions came from the king and radiated outward. England still had local customs, but the final say concentrated near the royal chamber. Replacing who held power made that concentration stick. Norman followers received estates taken from Anglo-Saxon elites who had backed the wrong side or simply stood in the way. Earls, thegns, and wealthy townsmen lost status and property as Norman companions. Knights and barons with ties to Normandy took over. These transfers did more than shuffle names on charters. They created a network of landholders whose fortunes depended on the king's favor and who expected rewards for service. Loyalty ran through kinship and shared campaigns, not village memory. A new class of tenants-in-chief sat between the crown and everyone else, giving orders in French across a land that still spoke English. Continental practices framed every transaction. Tenure bound land to specific obligations, castle guards, scutage in later decades, and defined payments on life events like inheritance, wardship, and marriage. Homage and fealty became ritual and contract, performed in halls where lords and men swore to stand by each other's claims. The record-keeping that followed tightened accountability. When an heir came forward, he paid relief. When a tenant died leaving a minor, the lord took wardship and the profits of the land. These incidents created predictable income streams and reinforced hierarchy. At the top, the king claimed overlordship over the whole pyramid, which meant he could call in services, exploit forfeitures, and decide disputes that crossed lordly boundaries. Stone castles turned that structure into scenery and signal. Motte and bailey works rose quickly after 1066, followed by heavier keeps in strategic towns and river crossings. Their purpose was not to shelter villagers. They projected control over roads, markets, and farmlands, and they housed garrisons that enforced the new order. A castle gate controlled who paid toll, who passed armed, and who gathered in the square. For many communities, the most visible change after conquest was a new fortress on the hill and a new constable demanding labor to maintain it. The message was simple. Authority had moved closer and it had walls. With new rulers came a cultural gap. The language of the elite shifted to Norman French and Latin. Charters, court proceedings, and estate accounts followed suit. Names at the top changed, food and fashion in noble halls changed, and church appointments favored Norman clerics. English law did not vanish, but its expression filtered through foreign tongues and expectations. Even as markets kept running and fields kept yielding, the people who judged disputes and collected dues belonged to a different world from the people who paid them. Within a generation, over 90% of England's land sat in the hands of Norman nobles. That concentration explains the speed and depth of the transformation. A crown with loyal tenants-in-chief, an administrative habit of writing and auditing, and hard points of stone reorganized power into a system that answered upward first. In the decades after conquest, kings began to trade improvisation for habit. Royal charters spelled out obligations and protections in terms people recognized. and officials started to apply those terms with some regularity. The king's word still mattered, but it now moved through forms. Writs that initiated cases, recorded fines, and commanded sheriffs to act. A dispute no longer had to depend on who knew which lord. It could start with a short written order that forced a hearing in a recognized venue. That shift mattered because it turned private bargaining into public process, and it taught people to expect the same steps wherever a royal officer appeared. Royal courts grew from the household into a system with reach. The king's bench and the exchequer did more than decide quarrels. They managed land claims, debt, and revenue with rules that others could learn. When a tenant said his lord had wrongfully seized land, the crown offered a standard path to test the claim. When money changed hands and promises failed, litigants found forms of action that fit their problem. Over time, those forms multiplied and became tools that laypeople and local lawyers could choose from. Lords still ran their own courts, but the gravitational pull of the king's justice increased with every case the center accepted. Procedure did the heavy lifting. Juries of recognition replaced heated oath swearing with sworn local verdicts on specific questions. Who had the better right to a field, whether a road was public, how much a debtor truly owed? Writs named the issue and narrowed what the court examined. Timetables set when parties appeared and what happened if they did not. Even penalties began to track the offense rather than the offender's weakness. This did not erase bias, but it bounded it. The same form in one shire looked more like the form in another, and litigants learned that a missed deadline or a wrong plea could cost a case. Law turned into something people could invoke. A man dispossessed of a small holding could seek a possessory writ and force his lord to answer before royal justices. Towns with charters cited privileges to resist extra tolls. Merchants pointed to safe conducts and standard measures to keep trade moving. These appeals worked because clerks wrote them down, kept copies, and expected officers to follow the script. A practical literacy grew around royal government, how to get a writ, what it cost, which plea fit the facts. Expectations rose with that literacy. If the crown announced a scale of reliefs or a limit on amercements, heirs and tenants planned around those numbers. If the king promised that free men would not be decised without lawful judgment, people treated that promise as a norm they could press in court. A king could still break faith, but now he did so against a record that others could cite back to him and against customs his own judges had taught the realm to trust. John did not climb to the throne on a wave of loyalty. He inherited it with doubts attached. Long before 1199, his brother's reigns and his own maneuvers had taught the realm to treat him as a risk. He grew up as the youngest son in a family where titles and lands moved through competition, not calm succession. He learned to cut deals, switch sides, and test limits, and the kingdom learned to expect that from him. When Richard I spent years on crusade and in captivity, John tried to secure power at home and abroad. Those attempts left a record of rivalry with trusted officers and with his own kin. By the time Richard died, many magnates saw a claimant who had rehearsed disloyalty and now asked for faith. The defeats that followed undercut his image further. In continental politics, he lost key strongholds and allies, exposing English barons with estates across the Channel to seizure and upheaval. Marriages arranged for advantage turned into disputes about dowries, inheritances, and custody of heiresses, which fed rumors that John bent law to private ends. He relied on a tight circle of household men and administrators, then turned on them when outcomes displeased him. That pattern set nerves on edge among those who depended on charters and confirmations to secure their lands. His method of rule sharpened those fears. He punished harshly and unpredictably. Hostages became leverage. Sheriffs who missed targets faced ruinous audits. Those who delivered paid again for renewed favor. He shifted officers frequently, sold offices, and demanded payments to keep them. Letters summoning men to answer for all that he owed and had done signaled that past service did not protect against sudden prosecution. That made magnates feel exposed, because wealth under feudal law rested on the crown's permission and a paper trail that could be read against them at any time. Barons began to read his temper as a direct threat to property. A confirmation of title might arrive one month, then a demand for relief beyond custom the next. Disputes over wardship and marriage turned into cash extractions. If a lord hesitated to comply, the crown could hold a son or nephew as a pledge. Those tools existed before John, but he used them with a frequency and edge that replaced negotiation with fear. A fortress that stood between a baron and his enemies also stood between that baron and the king's officers, and John reminded them which gate mattered. Reputation compounded the policy. Stories spread of officials blinded, prisoners starved, and families pressured to produce money or access. Even when details blurred, the lesson stuck. No one could predict where the line stood. The safest course often meant giving up leverage before being asked. Some nobles surrendered castles without a formal demand because they assumed a refusal would invite worse. That response did not come from loyalty, it came from calculation. They judged that holding out would trigger confiscation, fines, or the loss of heirs placed in royal custody. John inherited more than a crown. He took control of a cross-channel empire built by his father and brother, Normandy as the core, Anjou and Maine tying the west, and Aquitaine stretching deep into the south. These lands carried wealth, ports, and fortresses that anchored alliances. Prestige lived in them. A king who held Normandy faced France as an equal, not as a provincial lord. English barons also tied their fortunes to these territories. Many held estates on both sides, married into continental families, and depended on stable routes for trade and travel. The realm's status abroad and its politics at home both ran through those French possessions. John started under pressure and made choices that magnified it. He faced rivals for lands and loyalty in France, and he needed to move fast to secure castles, vassals, and tribute. He married to strengthen his position in Aquitaine, which inflamed disputes with neighboring lords and undercut previous alliances. When conflict escalated with the French king, the campaign that followed exposed gaps in John's command. He struggled to keep a coherent strategy while managing overlapping obligations, ransoms, and the costs of garrisons across scattered strongholds. Setbacks followed in sequence. Key allies drifted or were peeled away. Castles that should have held as anchors surrendered after short sieges. Royal treasuries bled to maintain mercenaries and to buy time. Coordination failed between fronts, and relief forces arrived late or not at all. A king who could not protect a vassal's fortress or recover seized lands lost more than stone walls. He lost confidence. News traveled fast through letters and merchants. Each fall of a keep chipped at his reputation as a war leader, the measure by which medieval kings were judged. The loss of Normandy hit hardest. Once that core slipped, the rest of the continental structure wobbled. Maine and Anjou followed the same gravity. Aquitaine held in part, but only with strain and constant expense. The image of an English king commanding across the Channel dissolved into a defensive posture on the coast. Nobles who had long counted on royal strength to guard their continental estates now counted their losses. They saw charters and marriages arranged under one map become liabilities under another. At home, loyalty turned brittle. John's attempts to recover ground required cash, and cash meant scutage, tallage, and forced loans. Knights who had once followed banners received demands for payments in lieu of service, often repeated within short spans. Towns met new levies and tighter control over trade. Sheriffs received sharp orders to squeeze arrears and to press supplies for garrisons. Every demand pointed back to defeats in France, and every defeat provided the next pretext to collect more. Resentment deepened because results did not improve. Barons asked why fresh sums produced no decisive victories. Those who lost manors on the continent blamed strategy and leadership. Hostages and fines fed anger rather than commitment. The court's prosecution of alleged failures sounded like deflection to men who felt the cost personally. Opposition began to organize not from one scandal but from the steady pattern. Pay more, lose more, and accept blame when plans unraveled. Defeats in France left John with fewer trophies and more bills. He needed garrisons on the coast, ships at short notice, and mercenaries willing to serve for cash. Glory could not refill the treasury, so the crown turned to extraction. Sheriffs received orders to collect arrears with less leniency. Royal justices calibrated fines to raise income, not only to keep order. Loans called benevolences arrived as commands. The message filtered down the shires: campaign failures would be paid for at home, and payment would not wait for consent. The tool he reached for most often was scutage, money in place of knight service. In theory, a baron owed mounted warriors for a set number of days each year. In practice under John, campaigns multiplied and scutage followed each summons. The rate crept upward, and collection grew aggressive. Officers tallied who was late, who disputed liability, and who could be pressed through hostages or threats to titles. Reliefs on inheritance came high. Wardships were held tightly for their profits. Marriages of heiresses were sold for sums that strained even major houses. Tallage hit royal towns and demesne lands, while merchants saw new demands tied to safe conduct and markets. Revenue streams that had been occasional became frequent, and those that had been predictable turned sharp. Barons expected to be asked before being charged for extraordinary levies. Instead, demands landed as fate's accomplice. John did not convene broad council to seek consent. He sent writs. When a levy faced pushback, he did not pause to negotiate terms. He switched to penalty and pressure. Sheriffs carried letters that named delinquents, and exchequer clerks kept score. The crown's appetite for cash outran the old rhythm of feudal custom, and men who thought their duties were defined found the definition rewritten by demand. Money concentrated grievances that had spread across years. A magnate who had lost a Norman estate now paid scutage for campaigns meant to fix that loss and saw no result. A lord who waited months for a case at court received a fine out of proportion to the fault, and then another for delay. Hostages taken for good behavior returned only after yet another payment. Even those with no wish to oppose the king began to calculate the cost of staying quiet. Accounts kept by stewards showed outflows for reliefs, aids, fines, scutages, and tallages stacking within short spans. Resentment hardened into organization when neighbors compared ledgers. The effect spread beyond great men. Knights who held small fees struggled to meet repeated scutage without selling stock or pledging future crops. Towns complained that tallage undercut trade and left little to invest in walls and bridges. Clergy felt the squeeze through vacancies kept open so the crown could take the income. With every round, trust eroded. The king's need for money felt permanent. The baron's capacity to absorb it did not. John's fight with the church began with a vacancy and a question of control. When the Archbishopric of Canterbury fell open, monks at the cathedral chapter elected their own candidate quietly. John pushed a rival, treating the see like another lever of royal administration. The dispute reached Rome, and the papal decision rejected both early choices and named a different man instead. John refused to accept him and barred his entry. That refusal was not a minor snub. The Archbishop of Canterbury crowned kings, mediated disputes, and anchored ecclesiastical courts. By blocking the appointment, John challenged the church's authority to govern its own house, and by extension, the spiritual framework that confirmed his own rule. The quarrel edged from personnel to principle. the crown claimed customary rights over appointments and revenues during vacancies. The papacy claimed jurisdiction over the soul of the realm through its bishops and the discipline of clergy. When John kept the see in limbo and held its income, he treated sacred offices as fiscal assets. That choice invited more than political pushback. It questioned whether the king recognized limits when those limits came from canon law rather than feudal custom. In an age when kings sought blessing for legitimacy, setting aside the church's choice carried a cost that no baron's protest could equal. Rome answered with sanctions that bit into daily life. England came under an interdict. Public worship halted. Churches closed their doors for most services. Marriages could not be solemnized in the usual form. Funerals, a core rite of community, moved outside consecrated spaces. Bells that marked hours and announced rites fell silent. The absence was conspicuous in towns and villages where sound structured the weak and signaled authority as clearly as any sheriff's writ. The silence did not only sting the pious, it unsettled rhythms of trade and custom that centered on feast days and markets tied to the liturgical calendar. Sanctions also targeted the king personally. Excommunication severed him from the sacraments and cast doubt on his standing before God. That broke the ritual bond that underwrote obedience. Oaths had meaning because they were taken under God's witness. If the king stood outside that witness, then those who served him faced a spiritual dilemma. Barons, clerks, and knights did not need a theory of resistance to hesitate. They needed only fear that obedience could endanger their souls. That fear diluted loyalty at the edges, complicating recruitment, negotiations, and the credibility of promises made in the king's name. The church proved itself the one institution that could meet the crown on equal footing. It had courts, revenue, networks of communication, and moral authority that crossed borders. Sheriffs could seize goods, bishops could forbid burial rites. The papacy could rally foreign allies and offer absolution to those who sided with its directives. While John leaned on hostages and fines, bishops and abbots carried the interdict into every parish, backed by clergy who held the confidence of lay people. The contest therefore played out not just at court, but at every village altar and church porch. They were not a crowd from the streets. They were landholders with halls, armor, and retinues. Men who rode with banners and owned the courts that judged their tenants. By 1214, they read the king's conduct as an attack on settled custom. Payments that had once arrived at long intervals came in waves. Offices turned into commodities. Wardships and marriages, which carried defined expectations, felt like auctions run from the royal chamber. These nobles kept account books and tallies. They saw patterns. What one house called a private grievance, another recognized in its own ledger. The sense that the king had crossed old lines grew into a claim that he had broken the framework that bound ruler and realm. They did not announce a new order. They appealed to an old one. Letters circulated that spoke of ancient customs and the promises of earlier rulers, using language that sounded conservative rather than rebellious. The case they made said the king had obligations as clear as any baron's, and that enforcement of those obligations was loyal service, not treason. They gathered at strategic points: Northampton, London's outskirts, the northern shires, choosing ground where they could muster men and control roads. Their demands reached beyond one fine or one office. They wanted limits that would hold on the next day to the next officer in the next county. Personal complaints provided the spark. Widow forced to buy permission to remain unmarried, an heir charged a relief above custom, a sheriff keeping profits beyond his term. Each story traveled. Stewards traded notes at fairs. Clerks, who served great houses, compared writs and found the same phrases demanding payment without delay. The accumulation produced a calendar. Gather allies, set out a program, press it together. Private petitions that once trickled into court turned into coordinated terms, and magnates who had spent years in competition sat down to draft a shared list. When they met to swear support, they brought not only swords, but texts. Villains still owed labor on manors, and towns minded their own bargains. The men who took oaths against the king wore mail and commanded keeps. They could blockade bridges, stop shipments of grain, and draw on clients who owed service by charter. Because their strength rested on property and followers, their risk ran high. Failure meant forfeiture, hostages, and siege. That calculation made their unity the decisive factor. If they fractured, the crown could pick them off with pardons and prosecutions. If they held, the king would face an opponent who could deny him mobility and revenue at once. Old rivals set aside wounds because the cost of division had become obvious. Northern lords, marcher barons, and magnates around London aligned their timelines. They named captains, set watches, and coordinated musters with the same care they used in war. Their program took on a moral frame and a legal one. They styled themselves the Army of God and the Holy Church, a title that signaled piety to clergy and purpose to laymen. At the same time, they spoke the language of custom and law, insisting that written terms could bind where promises had failed. With banners raised and articles in hand, they made themselves a negotiating force, and the king could not treat them as scattered petitioners. As the season turned, the movement advanced from declarations to the choice of ground, where talks would be held under guard and with pens ready. Talks faltered, then stalled. Envoys rode between camps with lists and counterlists, but no one would concede on money, hostages, or the control of key offices. The king offered pardons tied to fresh payments and oaths. The rebels insisted on terms that would bind future sheriffs and justices, not just the mood of the moment. Seasonal musters turned negotiation into a race against time. As spring levies filled and garrisons stocked, each side treated every day lost at the table as a day gained in the field. Messages hardened into ultimatums. Once a few demands met flat refusals, the script flipped from petitions to orders. Armed retinues moved first against weak points. Isolated keeps with small garrisons and royal manors with thin defenses. Captains pressed for quick submissions to avoid long sieges that drained supplies. A surrendered gate meant control over roads, ferries, and markets. County by county, local officers had to choose whether to obey royal writs or stand aside. In some shires, constables yielded stores and hostages on promise of fair terms from the rebels. In others, royalists burned grain and broke bridges to slow advances. The map began to show pockets of authority rather than a single realm. Castles mattered because they collected revenue and guaranteed safe passage. When rebel barons took control of bridges and river crossings, sheriffs lost the means to move men and money safely. Towns with charters weighed risk. If they declared for the king and the rebels prevailed, fines and confiscations would follow. If they leaned rebel and royal relief arrived, their gates would face the siege engines. Local disputes that had simmered for years, over mills, forests, and tolls, flared as each side tried to lock in allies. Every stronghold that changed hands altered bargaining power at the next parley. Loyalty fractured under pressure. Some magnates sent sons to one camp and nephews to the other to hedge outcomes. Household knights followed their lords, but a few slipped away to protect home manors rather than ride in distant campaigns. Clerks who kept accounts for great houses stalled payments to royal officers, citing uncertainty over lawful authority. Oaths taken months earlier felt provisional when both sides claimed to defend custom. What had been a quarrel over terms now looked like a sorting of the realm. The possibility of total civil war moved from rumor to planning. Muster points were fixed. Siege trains were assembled from timber, iron, and raw rope. Stores of grain, salt meat, and arrows were pulled from villages and stacked behind walls. Roads carried more wagons and fewer trade goods. Coin clipped from markets ended up in pay chests. With each seizure, the chances of a rapid settlement faded. Both sides prepared to endure through the harvest. Fear spread with every levy and requisition. Villages along invasion routes stripped fields early to keep supplies from foraging troops. Merchants delayed shipments, unsure which toll gate would stand next week. Abbeys hid movable assets, expecting billeted troops from either side. Rumors multiplied. Who had switched sides, which gates stood open, how many engines moved on the road. Commoners did not choose the quarrel, but they paid for it in broken fences, missing stock, and courts that no longer sat on schedule. After London shifted sides and strongpoints fell in clusters, neither camp could force a quick decision. The rebels held key roads and a fortified capital. The king retained major castles and loyal garrisons. Sieges dragged, supplies narrowed, and both treasuries strained. Each fresh levy risked alienating another set of allies. A summer of assaults promised exhaustion rather than victory. That math pushed leaders toward terms. They needed a pause long enough to settle rules without handing the other side a battlefield advantage. The king believed the barons wanted to strip his prerogatives and use piety as cover. The barons believed the king would sign anything under pressure and unmake it once he recovered. Each side kept scouts close and envoys on short leashes. Before any meeting, they argued over hostages, safe conducts, and who would put proposals in writing first. Drafts moved back and forth with deliberate vagueness. No one wished to concede wording that could be flipped in court or in council later. Every clause risked becoming a weapon. Yet, urgency cut through the posturing. Provisions stored for sieges could not feed shires indefinitely, and the harvest window was closing. Trade slowed under tolls and blockades, and cash reserves ran thin even for great houses. If the armies stayed in the field, the war would spread to regions that had avoided the worst. That danger weighed on clerics, merchants, and knights who managed estates. They pressed their patrons for a settlement that turned off the tap of scutage and requisitions. A negotiated framework, even a temporary one, promised predictability. Without it, the realm faced a long winter of raids and arrears. Choosing ground became its own negotiation. They needed a place with water, open approaches, and no resident power to tilt proceedings. They preferred a site where each party could arrive with an escort, post lookouts, and still claim not to be under the other's walls. Runnymede fit those needs. It sat between Windsor, a royal fortress, and the rebel-held country beyond the Thames. Flat meadow, river barrier, and nearby roads made access easy and ambush harder. The symbolism mattered too. A meeting on common land rather than in a lord's hall implied a public settlement rather than a private bargain. The mood before the talk stayed tight. Camps stood within sight with banners set and horses saddled. Messengers crossed the meadow carrying sealed notes instead of shouting terms across lines. Scribes prepared to record undertakings as they were made, because a written trail would be the only anchor if tempers shifted. Hostages moved in pairs, exchanged for hours rather than days, so neither party could claim the other had seized leverage under truce. Even mealtimes were choreographed to avoid surprise gatherings that could look like musters. Runnymede did not host a friendly ceremony, it hosted a submission. John arrived with mounted men within reach and Windsor behind him. The barons stood under arms with London at their back. The charter that emerged was not a shared vision. It was a list of terms pressed on a king whose choices had narrowed to two: accept or face a siege train moving closer by the day. Seals replaced swords only because both sides knew the swords could return the next morning. Coercion framed every clause. The barons kept hostages and garrisons, the king kept castles and sheriffs. Drafts passed between tenths with corrections that aimed to close loopholes a hostile court might exploit. John did not negotiate like a partner. He calculated how to survive the week. Each concession covered a specific pain point. Scutage rates, reliefs, wardships, local courts, tolls. Meant to stop seizures and arbitrary fines that had pushed magnates into rebellion. The text promised remedy more than principle, enforcing a ceasefire through procedure. The pressure was immediate and visible. Armies camped within sight. Ferries stayed crewed for sudden departures. Messengers rode with sealed packets and came back with altered lines. The men who drafted the clauses knew they were writing under threat. That is why the document carried enforcement machinery. Security by named overseers with power to lawfully distress the king if he failed to comply. A monarch who refused would face collective action as a stated right, not mere revolt. No English king had accepted such written checks before. Royal power had met oaths and custom. It had not met a charter with teeth. The aim was narrow. End the rebellion now. No one expected the shires to wake to a new social order. Villains still owed labor, lords still held courts, the church held its sphere. What needed to change was the stream of unpredictable demands. So the charter froze practice into rules, turning royal habits into obligation. It capped payments, regularized summons, fixed procedures for judgment, and promised access to established courts. Stability, not theory, sat on the page. John's posture remained reluctant. He issued letters and affixed the Great Seal because refusal risked a direct assault on Windsor and a wider collapse of support. He saw the charter as a pause, not a surrender. Reports from the camps made that clear to observers. He yielded points, then complained at once that they trespassed on his crown. The barons, for their part, treated every signature and duplicate as insurance, making multiple engrossments for distribution across counties so sheriffs and justices could not feign ignorance. The novelty of a king bound in writing still startled even those who wanted it. Lords were used to charters that granted markets or liberties to towns. They were not used to a charter that turned back toward the throne and dictated limits upward. The presence of clerks, bishops, and city representatives confirmed that this was meant to be seen, copied, and cited. Yet the mood never softened into celebration. Swords stayed belted. Scouts kept watch. Windsor's garrison stayed alert. John did not intend to keep the terms. He treated the seal as a stopgap and, by contemporary accounts, did not study the clauses with care. In his mind, the charter bought him time to seek annulment and to reorganize his forces. That is why the ink dried under a cloud. Everyone on that meadow understood the signature solved the siege, not the struggle over power. And before long, the king would act to erase the parchment he had just sealed. Magna Carta did not read like a sermon on liberty. It read like a contract dispute with footnotes. The barons brought problems that had costs attached, and the text fixed those costs step by step. Clauses lined up remedies to named abuses. When the crown could levy, how much heirs must pay, who could take custody of lands, what deadlines sheriffs must meet, and which court should hear which kinds of complaints. It addressed behavior that had become profitable for the king's officers and painful for those who paid them, turning unwritten expectations into enforceable terms. The charter drilled into possession and inheritance with a level of detail that only people anxious about losing estates would demand. Heirs were to receive their property without extortionate reliefs. Widows gained specific protections against forced remarriage and against having their dowers stripped by opportunistic officials. Guardianship over minors. The lucrative wardship that let a lord profit from an heir's lands. was limited to maintenance rather than exploitation. Disputes over who held a manor or whether seizure occurred without lawful judgment were routed toward recognized procedures rather than done by surprise. Feudal payments that had drifted upward under John were fenced back. Reliefs had ceilings. Scutage, the cash in place of knight service, was to be taken on a regular basis and under counsel rather than at whim. Aids, the occasional levies tied to specific events, were narrowed to set occasions. Debt, the crown's favorite instrument, received attention too. If a debtor died, his goods were not to be stripped beyond what the law allowed, and creditors had to respect the needs of dependents and the tools of a tenant's trade. These limits did not cancel obligations, they calibrated them. Procedure carried the rest. The charter set out where and when royal courts would sit, and who had the right to attend. It described writs and inquiries that should replace raw command. It stated that amercements, the fines that could spiral far beyond an offense, must be proportionate and consider a person's means. Merchants gained safe conduct and standard measures. Towns with charters saw confirmation of liberties. Even in forests, the document signaled boundaries for enforcement, anticipating the separate charter of the forest that would follow. The beneficiaries were clear. The language guarded the interests of tenants-in-chief, lesser freeholders, and the church. Bishops and abbots saw recognition of ecclesiastical liberties and the freedom to manage elections. Barons secured oversight of how the king's men handled property and payments. Villeins remained bound to manorial custom and owed labor as before. The charter did not promise universal equality. It focused on the people who could bring retinues to a meadow and force a negotiation. Its purpose was restraint, not reinvention. The clauses did not draft a new constitution. They pulled royal hands back from profitable edges. No arbitrary seizures, no endless increases, no judgments without the forms that gave proceedings a public face. The tone matched the goal. The language was dry, repetitive, and practical, specifying amounts, venues, time limits, and offices by name. It read like instructions to a machine that had been running too hot for too long. Magna Carta took the king's broad discretion and fenced it with rules. It named areas where royal had to stop, or at least slow down and pass through forms that others could check. Decisions about scutage, reliefs, and amenities were tied to council and scale. Seizures required a recognized process. Jurisdictional boundaries told sheriffs and justices where they could and could not act. The point was not eloquence, it was friction. By inserting steps between order and outcome, the charter made sudden commands harder to carry out and easier to contest. Arbitrariness lost ground in courtrooms and in the exchequer. If a tenant faced a crushing fine, assessors had to consider the ability to pay. If an heir sought entry to his lands, the relief followed a ceiling rather than a whim. If a merchant moved goods, standard measures and safe conduct cut down on opportunistic tolls. These requirements did not make the king weak. They made his officers predictable. Predictability is restraint in practice. When clerks must write a writ and cite a ground, they leave a trail that others can challenge. When sheriffs know they must assemble a jury or produce a record, they slow down and follow steps. The deeper statement sat behind the procedures. The king answered to law he did not write on the fly. By lawful judgment and by the law of the land became phrases that forced a pause. They told royal servants that power moved through channels already dug, not through the shortest path from command to compliance. A dispossession without judgment could be reversed. A penalty without scale could be cut down. The charter's language taught a habit. Ask what the law allows before you act, because the document that everyone can read now says so. Enforcement made that habit more than hope. The charter built a security clause that treated royal breach as a trigger for lawful distress. 25 named barons received standing authority to oversee compliance. If the crown failed to correct violations after notice, these overseers could take castles, lands, and goods until redress occurred. That mechanism converted protest into procedure. It moved opposition from rebellion to a kind of supervised pressure written into the settlement itself. No earlier English instrument had granted a group the right to seize royal property for non-compliance on terms recognized as legal. That detail explains the quiet shift in leverage. A sheriff who ignored the charter did not just anger a local magnate. He risked bringing the 25 and their allies to bear. A chancellor drafting a levy knew that collection without counsel could set the enforcement machinery in motion. The crown could still push, but it had to calculate around a device designed to push back. Even a reluctant king had to consider the cost of triggering a lawful seizure rather than a riot. The change was incremental, but it moved the frontier of authority. Royal initiative continued, yet every initiative now lived beside a text that other actors could cite and enforce. Councils gained weight because consent language mattered to revenue. Courts gained weight because procedure now carried promises that litigants expected to see honored. Those expectations did not end conflict. They refocused it into arguments over what the charter meant and whether its terms had been met. And while that debate unfolded, the group of 25 stood as a reminder that paper now had muscle. At Runnymede, the most unsettling promise for a medieval king sat in a few plain words. Punishment needed lawful judgment. That turned the spotlight from royal mood to recognized forms. A sheriff could not seize and jail a man because the crown frowned. He had to ground the action in a known plea and take it to a court that could hear it. The demand was simple but disruptive. It redirected the path of force through inquiry, verdict, and record. A lord's complaint might start a case, but it could not finish one without the steps that turned accusation into judgment. Protections against imprisonment without cause followed the same logic. If the crown wanted a body in a cell, it had to show why, set a timeline, and produce the accused in a venue that could test the charge. Holding someone at the king's pleasure no longer satisfied the new norm. Custody required a writ that named the reason, and delay invited challenge. That pressure did not empty prisons, but it altered who landed there, and for how long. Officers who once used confinement as leverage had to recalibrate. A missing writ, an expired term, or a failure to summon a jury could force release or reduce penalties. Status still mattered, but procedure began to cut across rank. A knight accused of trespass and a merchant accused of debt met the same expectation, a hearing under recognized forms, not a backroom demand. Amercements had to be scaled to the offense and to the offender's means, which turned wealth from a magnet for higher punishment into a factor courts had to weigh. Merchants gained predictable tolls and measures, giving them a path to contest arbitrary seizures. Even baronial disputes found themselves funneled into inquiries where local men swore to facts rather than to loyalty. Justice shifted from favor to process. Access to the right words. A writ for novel disseisin, a summons for debt, an assize to test possession, became more valuable than a whispered promise at court. Scribes mattered because paper carried authority from shire to shire. A judge's circuit mattered because it brought the same questions to different counties and expected the same answers. When a clerk wrote that a party must appear at a day and place, that phrase created a schedule the sheriff had to respect. Miss the day and the case moved, meet it, and the other side had to answer in turn. Predictability grew from repetition. When juries of local men delivered sworn findings about boundaries, rights of way, or who first seized a holding, they replaced feud with fact-finding. When deadlines defined who could distrain, and by how much, they curtailed private vengeance. The crown still profited from fines and fees, but the ledger increasingly reflected scheduled entries rather than windfalls from fear. Officials who cut corners risked having their actions voided later, a practical deterrent in a system that now kept score. John treated the seal at Runnymede as a delay, not a pledge. Days after the engrossments went out, he tested edges. He instructed sheriffs to proceed as before where the charter's terms were vague, and he probed whether hostile garrisons would relax. He dispatched envoys abroad to scout for mercenaries and ships, signaling that he intended to rebuild leverage. He also gathered legal opinions from loyal clerks on whether promises extracted under duress bound a king. While copies of the charter reached shires, the court rehearsed ways to sidestep them. His cleanest exit lay above English politics. He appealed to papal authority to void what he had sworn, arguing that spiritual oversight trumped a settlement forced by armed men. The claim positioned the charter as an attack on royal rights blessed by the church and an assault on a king who had placed his realm under papal protection. The goal was to convert a domestic bargain into a case of ecclesiastical jurisdiction, where he believed he would find support. If Rome declared the document unlawful, he could treat obedience to it as a sin rather than a duty. That move cut the last threads of trust. The barons had insisted on written enforcement precisely because they expected this turn. When word spread that the king sought annulment, their skepticism hardened into certainty. Royalists who had urged acceptance as a practical necessity felt exposed, because their advice looked naive if the charter disappeared. Clergy and city leaders who had witnessed the settlement saw their role downgraded to stagecraft. Every officer who had paused collections or eased seizures now faced the prospect of being ordered to resume as if nothing had changed. John's logic stayed consistent with his habits. He held that terms conceded under direct threat did not bind a sovereign. In his view, legitimacy flowed from authority recognized by God and custom, not from compulsion by subjects under arms. He read the charter as a hostage document, a list signed to escape a siege, not a measure he had chosen. That belief made reversal not only tempting, but, to him, necessary to preserve the crown. He thought he could reaffirm prerogatives once Rome blessed the reversal and mercenaries restored his position. The response from Rome came fast and clear. Magna Carta was officially annulled within weeks, declared invalid almost as soon as it was sealed. With the charter branded void, the king's officers treated its clauses as dead letters. Sheriffs revived stalled exactions, constables held onto disputed castles, and justices ignored limits they had only begun to apply. The legal ground beneath the truce vanished, and with it the incentives that had drawn moderates into supporting compromise. Conflict surged back. Rebel leaders resumed musters and secured fresh oaths. London tightened its alliance with them, controlling money and movement through the capital's gates. Northern and eastern shires prepared for renewed sieges, while the crown hired foreign troops and rearmed key fortresses along river lines. Raids, blockades, and seizures returned to the calendar, and negotiations shrank to narrow exchanges over hostages rather than broad terms. The annulment did not reset the clock to spring. It pushed the realm deeper into open war, with both sides convinced that only force would settle what a sealed parchment had failed to hold. The annulment tore the truce away and exposed bare force on both sides. Writs that had paused seizures and fines no longer carried weight, so sheriffs returned to collections and constables refused to release disputed castles. Rebel leaders answered with musters on set days, calling knights and free tenants to ride with arms and provisions for fixed terms. Roads filled with pack horses carrying grain, salted meat, spare bowstrings, and iron for nails. Siege engines rolled out again from timber yards, and smiths worked through the night on bolts and fittings. Courts in several shires stopped sitting regularly because jurors would not travel on unsafe routes. The realm moved back into a war footing that touched every market and manor. Baronial strategy, focused on control, not pitched battles. They reinforced stone keeps with fresh hoardings, cleared fields of cover around walls, and dug new ditches to break cavalry charges. Garrison lists tightened. Named men guarded each tower, and watch shifts were logged to catch slackers. Stores were audited and rationed by week. River crossings became choke points with chains and boats held ready to cut pursuit. Where walls were weak, they built timber baileys to force attackers into narrow approaches. Scouts mapped fords and tracked royal foragers, then struck supply trains rather than main forces. Each captured manor delivered grain, fodder, and hostages, while each surrendered gate shifted toll revenue to the rebel exchequer. Royal power held in clusters around major fortresses and ports. The crown hired foreign soldiers and moved them between strong points to punish wavering districts. Sheriffs seized carts and draft animals, promising compensation later. Coastal towns supplied ships for troop movements along estuaries, avoiding rebel-held bridges inland. The network worked, but only where cash and fear reached. Between those nodes, authority thinned. Villages paid whoever arrived first, then claimed coercion when the other side demanded dues. Fragmentation replaced reform as the basic condition. Overlapping commands, different law days, conflicting orders, and taxes charged twice within a month. No one knew who would wear the crown a year hence. Some magnates hedged by sending younger sons to seek terms on both sides. Cathedral chapters stored charters in lead cases and limited access to cartularies, worried that a rival winner would revisit old grants. City leaders balanced loans against promises of future liberties, aware that a wrong bet could cost gates, markets, and mills. The uncertainty seeped into private contracts. Lenders shortened terms, stewards delayed major repairs, and abbots postponed leases until they saw which seal would authenticate them. Foreign influence turned a civil quarrel into a contest with international stakes. Envoys crossed the Channel, and ships landed men who owed no allegiance to local lords. The rebels escalated by inviting Prince Louis of France to claim the English throne, effectively offering the realm to a foreign ruler. His arrival brought siege experts and money from continental allies, plus a claim dressed in legality through marriage ties. That intervention forced royalists to argue not only loyalty to a king, but resistance to a foreign takeover, a message that resonated in some counties and fell flat in others where grievances ran deep. Magna Carta did not survive because everyone loved it. It survived because the politics of a broken realm needed a workable truce that people could live with. After war drained treasuries and split loyalties, the charter offered a script to calm collections, reopen courts, and bring garrisons in from the edge. Even those who had no fondness for written limits recognized that a known set of rules beat another season of sieges. That practical value kept it on the table when tempers cooled and offices changed hands. The turning point came with the vacancy at the top. A new minority government faced the task of holding the crown, while rival claimants still moved troops and bargained for towns. To keep magnates from drifting, the regents needed recognizable guarantees for property, payments, and legal routine. Reissuing the charter delivered that. It signaled continuity without the burdens that had made the earlier settlement collapse. Sheriffs could point to the text. Barons could show it to stewards. City leaders could justify loans against it. The document again became a tool for stabilizing revenue and order. But the reissue was not a carbon copy. The most combustible features, those that armed overseers with direct rights to distress the king, were trimmed or discarded. Enforcement shifted away from a standing committee of magnates and toward normal courts and councils. Clauses that read like war measures in 1215 were softened into statements of practice. The result lowered the temperature. It kept the crown from facing legalized seizure while leaving enough restraint for landholders to trust that fees would follow a scale and judgments would follow forms. This bargain worked because it accepted limits as a method, not a confession of defeat. The course stayed. No arbitrary decision, reliefs within bounds, amercements scaled to means, and access to courts on regular circuits. The edges changed. Fewer provisions that invited confrontation, more that normalized audit, inquiry, and consent. Lords could bring grievances without threatening the throne. Officials could collect without pretending custom had no voice. Each side gave ground to keep the framework intact. Reissuance also clarified language. Drafts tightened vague phrases that had caused fights in shire courts and at the exchequer. Timelines for writs and appearances read cleaner. Debt protection spelled out which goods could not be taken and in what order. Forest provisions began to peel away into a separate settlement, so this charter could concentrate on tenures, payments, and procedure. The streamlining mattered. It told users that the charter aimed to be used, not waved as a banner. The result was a text that broadened its base by lowering its demand. It asked for fewer heroics from enforcers and more routine from administrators. That shift turned opponents into reluctant customers. Magnates cited it to settle succession terms. Sheriffs used it to justify what they could not take. Merchants invoked it for safe conduct and standard measures. Over time, the habit of quoting clauses did more to plant limits than any threat of siege could. The charter solved nothing overnight, but it started to travel. Within a few years, kings reissued trimmed versions to win peace, and judges began to treat certain clauses like a reliable compass. People who never stood at Runnymede started treating it as if it were theirs. The text stayed mostly technical, but the reputation drifted. Each dispute that referred to it added a new layer, like notes scribbled in the margins that slowly became the main story. Fast forward to the later 13th century, and you find the document copied, glossed, and taught. Clerks turned its key clauses into a kind of shorthand for proper rule. Townsmen and lesser knights heard that there was an old agreement about lawful judgment and limits on exactions, and they used that idea to push back when sheriffs stretched the rules. The details were feudal, but the lesson felt broader. Rulers could be bound by stated norms. The charter's authority began to work less as a contract and more as a yardstick. By the 14th century, Parliament and courts leaned on it as a familiar source when they wanted to restrain royal officers. When new taxes appeared, critics cited the spirit of agreed counsel. When arrests looked arbitrary, advocates reached for the language of due process. The text did not change as much as the audience did. The more it was invoked, the more it meant. It gained force by repetition, like a precedent that becomes hard to ignore because so many decisions have rested on it. Lawyers were the charter's best carriers. They quoted clauses in arguments, wrote treatises that tied current disputes to an ancient settlement, and taught students that a king's will face procedural fences. Politicians followed them. Whenever a crown pressed too hard, someone raised the old charter as a shield, even if the fit was rough. Over time, the mismatch mattered less than the habit. The document became a tool for saying no. This is where its second life begins. The charter had been born to calm barons, not to map a constitution, yet it turned into a symbol. It spoke to equity when offices grew corrupt, to consent when revenue hunts grew inventive, and to fair trial when prisons filled. Because it addressed more than headlines, it could be applied to new pressures without rewriting it. That flexibility made it a permanent reference point, not a permanent solution. Leaders still fought, courts still split, and crises still erupted, but the charter set a baseline to fall back on. The charter didn't deliver liberty fully formed. It opened a lane that others had to pave. By the late 17th century, the argument had matured. People no longer treated the crown as a personal estate, but as an office bound by stated duties. The old clauses about lawful judgment and limits on levy were read as early anchors. They didn't solve the fights ahead, but they gave those fights a starting reference, a way to say that authority needed reasons. From there, liberty unfolded as a sequence of tests where each crisis forced a clearer rule. Freedom arrived through friction. Parliaments pressed claims about consent to taxation, judges weighed what counted as due process, and ministers learned that the king's will could not short-circuit established forms. Conflict produced boundaries. Compromise wrote them down. Reinterpretation did the rest. When people said the law stood between ruler and subject, they were translating a medieval restraint into a modern expectation that decisions must be justified. That expectation hardened into the idea of limited government, not as a slogan, but as a working habit. The shift from personal rule to institutional authority showed up in routine paperwork. Warrants needed signatures that could be checked. Courts demanded cause, not hints. Revenue sought formal votes instead of sudden demands. These practices turned power into something that had to pass through procedures. Offices mattered more than tempers. The king still reigned, but the machinery around him acquired a memory, and that memory set limits. Each office kept records. Each record could be challenged. The shape of government changed because rules were written in places that could not be ignored. This is where the language of rights begins to meet daily governance. A guarantee against arbitrary imprisonment becomes a requirement to state charges. A claim to judgment by peers becomes juries with defined roles. A bar on extraordinary levies becomes financial scrutiny. None of these arrive as gifts. They are carved out case by case, then taught to the next generation as normal. The result is less dramatic than a revolution and more durable than an edict. It is practice turning into principle. The key link to the medieval charter is not the exact wording, but the habit of appeal. People reach back to an old promise to make a new demand. Over time, that habit formed a standard. Power must justify itself. That is the mind-blowing part. A document drafted to secure a feudal elite ended up laying the groundwork for a rule that every modern official recognizes in some form. Before acting, explain. When challenged, show the rule. When spending, cite the authority. The logic spreads because it is useful. Institutions carry this forward. Parliaments claim control over revenue and the laws that raise it. Courts separate accusation from punishment and insist on process. Local bodies handle administration with rules that outlast the people in office. The crown still symbolizes unity, but authority moves through channels that slow impulse and expose abuse. Liberty grows where those channels hold, because they force reasons into the open. From a battlefield of barons and kings, a single document set an idea in motion that power should never be absolute. The Magna Carta didn't create freedom overnight, but it planted the seed that would grow into the liberties we still defend today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the birth of liberty, subscribe for more history that shaped the world you live in.